Well, thank you for that. And we're in one of our favorite places in the country tonight. And my wife Linda's over on this side. And we have been serving the Lord together. Back in July, we finished 51 years together. Now, she married a child. That's not too much of a joke. How many of you would say with me that knowing you're saved and serving the Lord is the greatest thing in the world? We look back over our lives, and we got married young, but we had a heart already to say this to the Lord. Lord, whatever you want us to do, we'll do our best to do it. And we always had a heart to go to the mission field. We had no idea where. Every time we heard a missionary, we wanted to go wherever they were talking about. But we moved from South Carolina in the Spartanburg-Greenville area in 1970 over to Tennessee Temple, over to Chattanooga to Tennessee Temple. And before I took a class, I read an article about the need to reach Muslims out in the Sahara. And God used that to direct us to Africa. And we spent a good portion of our lives in Africa. Our kids grew up there. 2 of them were born there. We just had our 18th grandchild a few months back. And Linda and I, we planned things really well. We have 9 grandsons and 9 granddaughters. Now, see if you can top, anyway, you probably have already topped it. But in all those years, God has been so good to us, and we're not as young as we used to be. But if we had it all to do over, we would say, Dear Lord, thank you for saving us, and we still want to serve you. Let me tell you one little story tonight. I guess I'm either famous or infamous for telling stories. So I'm going to tell you a little story tonight before I preach. But Richard Harper, evangelist Richard Harper, is my friend. And he was down in our church not too long ago, and he was telling me, he said, Brother Godfrey, did I ever tell you my passport story? And I said, I don't think so. He said, well, my wife and I and a friend from West Virginia were flying to Japan to preach for some of the missionaries in Japan. And I had put my passport, my wife's passport, and the friend's passport in my coat pocket. Well, they got on a small plane from West Virginia flying to Chicago, and he took off his jacket, put it up in the overhead bin, flew to Chicago, got off. They were sitting in the airport. He had his jacket. He reached in the pocket to get the passports and checked them, and his passport was there, and his friend's passport, but his wife's had been right in between the two, and it had slipped out and fallen out in the bin of that little plane. Well, they have a 4 or 5 hour layover, but they're headed for Japan. So he panicked, and he called American Airlines, and the lady who answered, the agent, had a Polish accent. And he said, ma'am, look, the plane left, I think, already, but I think my wife's passport is in the overhead bin. And she said, well, let me check. And she said, no, that plane's gone to a different city. And she said, but I think we can find it. We'll try to get it back to you by Thursday. He said, I don't think you understand, ma'am. We're sitting in the airport in Chicago. In a few hours, we're flying to Japan. And she said, well, let me see if I can help you. So she got on the computer and she started working around, and she came back and said, okay, that plane did leave. It flew to a certain city. It's on its way back to Chicago. It will land at a certain gate at a certain time. So Brother Harper took off over to that gate, and he asked the agent, could I go on the plane? We were sitting in seat 5, I think my wife's passport, and she said, you can't go on there. And he said, well, would you mind going on and checking? And she rolled her eyes. She didn't want to do it, but she did. So she came out with his wife's passport. And then he went back to the gate where his wife and friend were waiting there, and they were thanking God. And then he called American Airlines back. He had written down the name of that agent. And he said, ma'am, I just want you to know you are the second most important lady in my life right now. We found my wife's passport. And this agent said, praise the Lord. Brother Harper said, what did you say? She said, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean. He said, no, it's not that. You don't understand. I'm a Baptist preacher, and I'm headed to Japan to preach for a bunch of BIMI missionaries in Japan. And she said, did you say BIMI missionaries? A BIMI missionary family in Poland won my mama and father to the Lord. Now, that's just one of many things that are going on, but I want you all, I know you know it, but God's not dead. He's not taken by surprise. People are still being saved, and God's still answering prayer. Now, I want you to open your Bibles tonight to the book of Judges. I wish I could have been here this morning and heard my good friend, Jeff Amsbaugh. I know it was good. He and I have traveled the world and preached together in different places. The book of Judges, it's an interesting book. If I were to ask you, what's your favorite book in the Bible? What would you say? Well, many of you would have different favorite books. Some of you would say the book of Psalms. Some might say the Gospel of John or the book of Acts or the book of Romans. How many of you love the book of Romans? Or Philippians? And if I were to ask you what's your favorite book, you would give me whatever great book it is. But if I were to ask you what's your least favorite book in the Bible, which one would you point out? Maybe you've never thought about it, but I'm going to be just honest and transparent with you tonight. I love the Bible. God's used this book to change my life, and I love it. But if I had to pick probably my least favorite book, it might be the book of Judges. I just read it a few days ago in a different language, but I got to those last chapters. Do you remember what the last chapters of the book of Judges? And you got a young Levite who became an idolater, and he has an ephod, and he's in the house of an idolater. And then you have the man, he chopped his wife up and sent her all over the country. I mean, I read some of that, and it's kind of depressing. When you come to the last verse of Judges, here's what it says. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now that probably describes our day in so many ways. So if it's a hard book to read and it's parts of it are a little bit depressing, then why did God put it in His Word? Aren't you glad that He did? Because when you read through some of those chapters that are difficult to read through, remember this, that God gave us some powerful lessons, some powerful truth in this book. Could I remind you that one of my favorite books in the Bible is that little book of Ruth that comes right after Judges. And the story of Ruth took place during the time of Judges. But tonight I want to talk about a man that you know his name, you've heard a lot about him. Even the young people here tonight know the name of Gideon. Gideon, one of those well-known Bible characters. When we teach kids on the mission field and we have flannelgraph and stories, and we teach them about David and Goliath, and we teach about Daniel, and we teach about Noah, Gideon may come in there somewhere. How many of you have ever sung? Now don't worry, I'm not going to sing. But how many of you have ever sung, brave Gideon had 300 men. The Midianites had a host. But Gideon had the Lord with him, and so he had the most. Gideon had the Lord. Gideon had the Lord. He won the fight with the Midianites, for Gideon had the Lord. Well, Gideon is one of these men that really he grabs your attention once you come to chapter 6. I know I didn't tell you that, but now I did. So Judges chapter 6. I'm going to talk about Gideon, but before I get there, let me set the scene just a little bit. In verse number 1, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Now, when you read the Judges, one reason it's a little bit depressing is there's a clear cycle going on over and over and over in this book. The children of Israel knew the Lord. They had the blessings of the Lord. The Lord had delivered them from Egypt, brought them into the land of promise, and yet over and over again you read verses like this, verse 1, and they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now you tell me, when they did evil, what did God do? God brought one of those pagan tribal groups, in this case the Midianites, and it might be the Philistines, it might have been one of the other nations of Canaan, and they would come against Israel, and God would deliver Israel into their hands, and there would be battles, and they would punish them. Now, the Midianites were like our people in the desert. They rode camels. They would come into an area, and so they would let the children of Israel plant their crops and plant their fields, and about the time the crops were ready to harvest, the Midianites would show up. And they would go through, and they would take everything. Just imagine you work for 9 months of the year, and a group of people come in and take everything that you've been working for. And that's what they were experiencing. Well, when the people of God sinned, God brought a nation against them. And so now Israel and the people of that day were hiding. When they could find a portion of the field that had not been robbed, they would take the wheat or the grain, and they would find some cave or they would find some ravine, and they would hide so that they could save and salvage what little food they could salvage. Now, that brings me down to verse number 10. Chapter number 6, verse number 10. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. Those are sad words. But now in verse number 11, and there came an angel of the Lord and sat under the oak which is in Orpha, that pertaineth unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, young people and older people, just think with me. Can you get the picture? Here was Gideon hiding behind the winepress. Now, what's a winepress? It's an area where they put the grapes in, and they either stepped on them and squeezed the juice out. It was not a great big area. Here was Gideon hiding behind the winepress, trying to thresh a little grain here. But verse number 12, when you read this verse, well, let me read it and you see how this hits you. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, the Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. He is? Really? I'm a mighty man of valor, and I'm hiding behind the wine press to thresh a little bit of grain. And then in verse number 13, and Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Do you get the picture? Lord, if I'm a mighty man of valor, I've got some questions for you. Why are these things happening? Now, I'm not going to ask you how often you ask that question of God. Why is this happening? But he went on and said, and where be all the miracles? It's really easy for us, the children of Israel, forgot the miracles of God. They forgot the plagues in Egypt. They forgot crossing the Red Sea. They forgot how God led them through that wilderness for 40 years and took care of them. They forgot crossing the Jordan River and the walls of Jericho falling down. They forgot all that. And Gideon said, Lord, if I'm a man of valor, why is all this happening? And where all those miracles that our fathers and mothers have told us about. So let me talk about those questions. The first one is this question, why? That's a difficult question. I've been in a lot of churches. I love being around God's people. We see wonderful things, Linda and I think a few years, 3 or 4 years back, we've seen people saved all over the world, but now we've seen people saved on 6 different continents. not countries, continents. We never dreamed God would let us do that. But as we've gone out and we've been in churches all over the world, we've seen God answer prayer. We've seen wonderful things. Just recently, one of our missionaries to the military in Italy, they couldn't have services like many other places in the world. Everything was shut down. His father, would never come to church. He was a staunch Roman Catholic. He wouldn't even let his son witness to him. But the father's Roman Catholic church got closed down because of COVID. And our missionary reached out to him and said, look, I'm going to be preaching my sermons online. And if you would like, you can come and you can listen to my sermons online. And the dad said, well, I might do that. So he listened once, and he would send him the outlines, and he listened another week. And some weeks, Brother Chris War, the missionary, would say, now, if you would like to accept Christ tonight, this is what you do. And he would walk through the plan of salvation. And a few weeks into that, Chris War's father, he had been praying for him for over 36 years, trusted Christ as his Savior because of COVID. And so it's so easy for us to look around us and see all the things that are happening and say, why? The woman was bitter. In one church, they had been praying for their young pastor. He had cancer, and they had prayed, and they believed that God was going to do a miracle. But their pastor died and went to heaven. It's so easy for us when we see that to think about, well, why wasn't it someone else? Why wasn't it an older person? Why did this happen? Did you ever pray? Now, you don't need to raise your hand. I know the answer to this. But did you ever pray and it seems like God is not hearing your prayer? Is there someone on your prayer list and you've been praying for them for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 25 years and it seems like God is not hearing your prayer? In the book of Psalms we read, why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? Psalm 22 verse 2, O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not. It's easy for us to say, since God has not answered, at least we think so, those prayers, I'm just going to quit praying. Have you ever met someone who's mad at God? God, I've been begging you. I've been pleading with you to answer that prayer, and you haven't done it, and we can become bitter. And when God is apparently silent and inactive in the light of sin and suffering, sometimes we want to help him out a little bit. I told you I would be transparent, but I don't watch a lot of news. I do watch it, but I can't watch too much of it. You know why? Because if I watch much of it, my Marine Corps blood starts to percolate. And I can think even here, in our country, in the 60s, when the hippies were going to Woodstock, I joined the Marine Corps at 17 years old. And sometimes when I see the things that are going on in our country right now, and when I hear the things I hear, there are a lot of things go through my mind, and they're not all the best, okay? Some of the things I've heard this week makes me say I'll never watch another professional basketball game ever, okay? I'm just being honest with you. I'll say, Brother Godfrey, you're a spiritual, you're supposed to be I think I am. I hope I am. But when I look at what's going on around us and when I hear what we're hearing, it's hard for us to understand why. Habakkuk. In French, it's Habakkuk. In Habakkuk, the first chapter, I'm not going to read it to you, but I challenge you, go back and read the first chapter of Habakkuk. And the prophet's crying out to God and said, God, I'm looking around at our country and I'm seeing all this sin, I'm seeing the problems, and I'm seeing the difficulty. Lord, why are you letting this happen in my country? And God said to him, okay, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to bring the Assyrians and they're going to conquer Israel. And then Habakkuk said, Lord, I didn't mean that. And Habakkuk was crying out to God, a wail of despair, faith grappling with the problem. Is God doing anything about it? Sometimes it doesn't look like it. Godless professors questioning and destroying the faith of our young people. But can I remind you, that's not too far from the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. Yea, hath God said, the words of Satan in the very beginning. When's the last time you heard this? You don't believe that a God of love would allow these things to happen, do you? And it's so easy for us, just like Gideon, to say, Lord, why are all these things happening? I don't understand it. Preacher, why? Standing beside the casket of a mother and try to explain to those children why that happened. Right now we have 2 of our Beyond My missionary wives who are going to heaven unless Christ comes back in the next few weeks or months. One of them is in her early 50s, 4 daughters in college. And it's so easy to stand back and say, Lord, why? I don't have a great answer for that tonight, but here's what I do know. We don't have the answers now, but folks, we will have them. Our God is God. Our God is powerful. Our God is just. Our God is loving. And He doesn't choose to tell us every time, right when we want to know why this is happening. But He knows. How many of you are old enough to remember the song we used to sing? We'll talk it over in the by and by. We'll talk it over, my Lord and I. I'll ask the reason, and He'll tell me why. We'll talk it over in the by and by. Faith knows that God does right. Back in my days at Tennessee Temple, a great number of you here have no recollection. How many of you were around Chattanooga and Tennessee Temple, maybe back in what I call the good old days? I know some of you here at this church were. So you may know these names I'm going to use tonight for illustration. One of my friends back in the 70s was a man named Doug Howell. And Doug Howell worked at Tennessee Temple, and he and his wife were there. They had a child was born, lived a while, and then God chose to take that baby to heaven. And Doug Howell, who was not a preacher, wrote these words, and I just saw them again recently. He said, "We cannot ask the reason why, nor can we question God. We cannot doubt His wisdom or understand His love. For it was love that made Him taste death for every man. And it was love that guided His never-failing hand. And it was love that gave us a precious Son to love. And it was love that took Him home to live with Christ above. And it was love that granted grace so we could bear the pain. And it was love that gave us peace and made us smile again. And it is love that gives us the strength to live each day. And it is love that promised that He would never fail." Look, I don't have the best answer to that question, why? And there's one more question that Gideon did ask, and I'll get to that just in a moment. But I do want to show you what God said to him. Now let's back up. Are you still there? I didn't tell you to keep your place, but in Judges chapter 6, Gideon's hiding out behind the winepress, threshing grain. The angel comes, "Thou mighty man of valor." Ooh. If the Lord be with us, why are all these things happening, and where be all the miracles? In verse number 14, look at the verse. "And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? Now watch this. Gideon asked the question, why? And God did not give him a detailed explanation, but he did give him an answer. And the answer was only 2 letters, 1 word. The answer to his struggle with this why question was this: Gideon, just go. Go in this thy might. When things are going wrong, when you don't understand, it wasn't what he wanted, but it was what he needed. The Lord said this to Gideon: Gideon, get busy. We're still flying. Lynn and I, we're flying all over the place still. And I just told someone tonight in October, I'll be preaching in 4 missions conferences. The first one's in Tennessee. I can speak that language. The next week I'll be in Seattle, and the next week after that in Chicago, and the next week after that in Milwaukee. Now you said, Brother Godfrey, why are you telling him this? We're going to fly on those planes, and there are going to be people on there, and we're all going to have our mask on. And have you ever flown across country with a mask? Oh. They're going to have their mask on, and about 75% of people on that plane are going to be terrified. And we can start asking that question, what's the purpose of this virus? Why are these things going on? You know what, God, a good way to not be thinking about that all the time. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be prepared. I'm not saying we shouldn't be careful. But I'm saying this. Here's God's answer for us. Get busy serving Him. When we're hurting, when we can't figure out all these things that are happening, when our loved one gets cancer, the best thing we can do is find somebody who needs help and help them. Get busy, go. And that was God's answer. It was twofold. It was that. And then the second part of it is found down in, look at verse 16. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. And then look at verse number 22. And when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for because I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, Peace be unto thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. And then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom, the Lord of peace. Now watch, here was the answer to that why question. Go, get busy, serve the Lord. Don't sit around thinking about yourself all the time. Think about other people. Think about the Lord. Get busy. And number 2, remember this. We believers have the Lord with us all the time. Gideon, the reason you're a valiant man is not because of your quality of character, but it's because of the God you're serving. We can have the peace of the Lord. So understand that. Now, there were 2 questions. Do you remember that? One of them was why. God didn't answer that question fully, but He said to him, Go. And when you go, understand that I am with you. Lo, even the Great Commission, doesn't it say, Lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the world. Now, the second question, though, was this. Where are all the miracles? Our fathers have been telling us about all those things that happened in Egypt and crossing the desert and crossing the Red Sea. We've heard about all those miracles. Where are all these miracles? Well, God answers that question, and I'm not going to read them, so don't worry about it. But God answers that question in chapters 7 and 8. When the Lord said, when God used this man Gideon to defeat the Midianites, and if you go back and read the chapters, I won't read them to you, but if you read them, how many people did Gideon have with him when he started out to do battle with the Midianites? Does anyone remember? 32,000. And he said to them, well, if any of you guys are afraid and you don't want to fight and you don't want to get your hands dirty and you just want to go home, God said, send them home. And he did. And 22,000 of those soldiers went home. But he still had 10,000 men. And now God instructs him to take those 10,000 men down to the water to drink water. And Gideon ended up with 300 men to face a gigantic army of enemy soldiers. Where are all the miracles? Can I remind you all tonight at Franklin Road Baptist Church that our God is still a miracle-working God? And the miracles he did in the past, he can still do today. The miracles he did in the past, he is still doing today. God will save. God will help. God will give you strength. It doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter how bad the circumstances look. I brag on my wife all over the world, but she doesn't even like me to tell stories like this. But back in the 90s, we were living out in the jungle in Zaire. We tell people we had more fun than a barrel of monkeys because we ate them. But we were living out in the jungle on top of a mountain, hundreds of miles from electricity. And there was fighting all around us. Most 10,000 expatriates fled the country. We had been there 6 months. No one knew we were dead or alive. We didn't get any money for 6 months. Well, about 3 months later, 9 months into that, I had gone into the capital city. It took me 5 days to go. I had gone 5 days away. And when I got there, fighting started again, and the Christians would not let me leave. And for 5 weeks, I was caught in a compound in Kinshasa, Zaire. And Linda and our 3 younger kids were 500 kilometers from me up in the jungle, and I could not get back there. Did you think I never asked the question why? But can I tell you tonight, well, obviously you know the answer to this, because 5 weeks, that was the longest 5 weeks I ever spent in my life, I think. But I'm going to tell you this, I didn't understand all of it. I didn't have it figured out, but God knew all about it. And God took care of, not only took care of me, took care of Linda and our 3 kids. And those African Christians, every night, now think about this, in a place where they had so very little, every night for 5 weeks, Christians in our church took turns about walking around our house for 5 weeks. They would walk for miles and bring her a pineapple or a stalk of bananas or the hind leg off an antelope. Or I'm just listening to me tonight. I'm saying to you, you think we're going through some difficult times? Maybe. Why? I don't have a good answer to that, but God knows. Where are all the miracles? They're still there. God is still God. He is not dead. People are being saved. Churches are being built. God is answering prayer. Christians are growing. I know you hear a lot of negativity, but look, there are still some fine Bible-believing, Bible-preaching churches in the United States of America. And those of us who believe in the God that we serve should be willing to stand up and say, Lord, I haven't got it all figured out, but you told me, go. Go in this thy strength. Serve me. The miracles are coming. And dear Lord, I pray tonight that you'd help us as we live in this wicked world today to be the light and to be the salt that we should be. Encourage our hearts. Remind us of your power. Remind us that the miracles, you are still a miracle-working God. Remind us that every time a person gets saved, that's a great miracle. Lord, every time a church is raised up, that's a great miracle. Every time you answer a prayer, that's a great miracle. And Lord, may we never take it for granted. And I just ask that you would work in our hearts this evening. Would you stand, please, all of you? Musicians are going to begin to play. What about you tonight? I've just tried to share my heart with you tonight. It's so easy for us to look around and say, Lord, I don't understand this. Why are all these things happening?